The person you think you can trust most with your life might actually be hiding a secret so chilling it will make you question everything you've ever known about love, loss, and deception. Let's rewind the clock to 1970, a time when disco was just taking off and bell-bottom jeans were a fashion statement you might actually be proud of. And on one fateful day in Alabama, a small, innocent boy named Earl Dwayne Bunch III was about to be caught in the whirlwind of something far more sinister than anyone could have ever suspected. Earl was just 16 months old, a little bundle of joy with bright eyes, chubby cheeks, and a laugh so pure it could warm even the coldest of hearts. He was the kind of kid who probably stole the show every time he giggled, making everyone around him smile with no effort at all. His life, though short, was one of those lives you could look at and just know he was destined to bring happiness wherever he went. But then, in an instant, it was all ripped away. Earl's death on that fateful day in 1970 seemed like every parent's worst nightmare. A fall from his crib. Tragic, yes. Heartbreaking, absolutely. But an accident, right? That's what everyone assumed. The kind of tragedy you could explain away, even if it left a heavy knot in your stomach. The official story was simple. Earl had somehow tumbled from his crib, hit the floor, and the worst possible outcome occurred. A mother's worst nightmare. A child lost too soon. But there was something strange about this tragedy. Something that didn't sit right. Not in the way a child's death should sit right with anyone. Now, Alice Marie Idlett, Earl's mother, was undoubtedly devastated. Or at least, that's what you'd expect, right? A mother who's lost her baby. It's almost like a universal law. She'd be overwhelmed, heartbroken, inconsolable. But Alice's grief, well, it wasn't exactly what we might call typical. Let me tell you something. When a mother loses a child, the whole world expects her to break down, to show that raw, unbearable pain that you can feel in your bones. But Alice, well, let's just say her reaction didn't exactly match the tragedy. Sure, she was sad. She cried. She wept in private. But on the outside, Alice seemed strangely detached, almost distant, as if she wasn't fully there, like she had already checked out of the grief process way too soon. Now, that's a red flag, right? I mean, you don't have to be a psychologist to know that when a mother loses her child, there's supposed to be something there, some sign of emotional devastation. But Alice? It was almost as if the weight of her son's death wasn't really weighing on her the way it should. So, what's going on here? Did Alice's grief look different because it was genuine? Or was it something else entirely? Something she couldn't, or maybe didn't want to, share with the world? Let's pause for a second and think about this. How many of us have experienced loss? How many of us have known someone who, despite all appearances, seemed to hold it together when the world around them was falling apart? Losing a child isn't something anyone can just get over. It's not a wound that heals with time, like a scraped knee. It's a gaping, endless void. But what if, in some cases, that void hides something deeper? What if the grieving parent doesn't just hide their grief, but suppress it, because deep down they can't face it themselves? Grief can be so complicated. For some, it's a cloud of endless tears. For others, it's a wall they build so high no one can ever see the cracks. Alice didn't show the typical signs of sorrow we expect. It wasn't because she was tough or strong. Number it was because there was something far more complex going on underneath. Something that maybe she didn't even fully understand herself. And here's where things start to get really weird. The more you peel back the layers of Alice's reaction to her son's death, the more you have to ask, what if she was hiding something? What if this wasn't the innocent accident we all believed it was? What if that pain, so carefully kept hidden behind Alice's eyes, wasn't the heartbreak of losing her son, but something else entirely. Something darker. Because what if the death of little Earl wasn't an accident at all? What if it was all part of something far more sinister? What if that cold, detached grief wasn't the result of loss, but guilt? And what if Alice, this mother who should have been a picture of sorrow, was keeping a secret so horrifying that even she could hardly bear to face it? Stay tuned, because we're just getting started. The truth behind Earl's death is far from the story we've been told. And what we uncover next will shake you to the core. Let's talk about letters. Not just any letters, though. These were letters written by a mother to her husband, stationed in Vietnam. The kind of letters you'd expect to be filled with longing, perhaps a little loneliness, and an overwhelming sense of hope. After all, these were letters from a mother missing her husband, hoping to hold everything together for the sake of their child. But what if, instead of tenderness and love, they were filled with resentment, anger, and cold detachment? What if these letters weren't just revealing a mother's thoughts, but her very soul? Alice Marie Idlett's letters began with what you'd expect, the kind of sweet, familiar words you send to someone you love. A soft, comforting tone. A gentle description of everyday life. There were mentions of Earl's giggles, his new words, and the tiny steps he was taking as he learned to walk. The kind of stuff that, as a reader, you'd skim over, thinking, yeah, that sounds like a normal family. But as you keep reading, something starts to feel off. Something slowly turns the sweet, maternal words into something unsettling. A subtle shift, like the fog creeping in. It's almost imperceptible at first, until it's not. I hate him, she writes in one of the letters. He's ruining my life. Wait, what? Did I read that correctly? A mother, hating her own child. A 16-month-old child who has barely begun to understand the world around him. How can a mother, any mother, say such a thing about her flesh and blood? And how can she write it, in black and white, for her husband to read, as though this was just another detail about her day? Now, let's dive into this. Because what we're dealing with here isn't just anger. It isn't just frustration. It's something much darker. Alice's words weren't just an isolated incident. As you read further, it becomes clear that there's a pattern. A deep-seated, festering resentment that's boiling over. I hate him. There it is again, repeated like a broken record. Every page, every letter, dripping with the kind of coldness that no child should ever have to endure. But here's the thing. Anger doesn't just come out of nowhere. It doesn't appear overnight like some inconvenient storm. No, anger like this comes from somewhere deeper. It comes from years of frustration, isolation, and perhaps a feeling of being trapped in a situation that's impossible to escape. So, what was Alice really feeling? Was she truly hating her child? Or was it something else? A more complex and twisted web of emotions that she didn't know how to untangle? Was she angry at Earl for being the one thing she couldn't control? Angry that she felt lost in a world that no longer made sense? Perhaps, as the letters show, she was at war with herself, a battle she couldn't admit, even to her own heart. Let's pause and take a step back, because this is where the human psyche gets complicated. We all know that motherhood can be a beautiful, fulfilling experience, but it's also grueling, exhausting, and sometimes downright overwhelming. Alice, like so many mothers, may have felt like she was doing it all alone. She was a young mother, raising her son without her husband's constant support, with only her own emotional turmoil to rely on. And then there's guilt. The kind of guilt that eats you alive from the inside out. Alice likely felt it, in some form or another, every single day. for feeling angry, guilt for feeling trapped, guilt for having thoughts about her child that she could barely control. It's easy to sit in judgment, isn't it? To say, how could she feel that way? But the truth is, sometimes the darker emotions go unnoticed, even by the person feeling them. She could have been so deep in this psychological storm that she couldn't even see it. She could have been battling demons she didn't even know how to name. Let's dig even deeper. Because here's something you might not want to hear. Sometimes parents, especially mothers, carry burdens they can't share. They feel a weight so heavy, so suffocating, that it seems impossible to even breathe. What happens when you can't show the world how much you're hurting? What happens when you feel like you're in a constant battle with yourself, unable to let anyone in? The answer? You hide it. You bury it. And in some cases, you write it down. You put it in a letter where no one can see the tears running down your face. You pour your frustration and resentment into words that, at the time, seem like the only thing that makes sense. Was that what Alice did? Did she write down her darkest thoughts as a way of releasing some of the pressure? Or was it something more calculated, something darker still, an admission of a truth she couldn't face? Now, imagine what it was like when Alice's letters came to light. Because this wasn't just a secret kept between her and her husband. This was a secret that, once uncovered, shook the very foundation of the family and community. The Alice that everyone thought they knew, the grieving mother who lost her child too soon, was suddenly not the person they thought she was. Her written words, once private and buried, transformed her love for her son into something unrecognizable. What was once a mother's anguish over the loss of her child turned into something much more sinister, something so chilling that it left everyone around her gasping for air. The chilling realization hit hard. What if this wasn't just an accident? What if something far worse happened that day in 1970? You see, sometimes the truth doesn't just come knocking. Sometimes it screams at you from a piece of paper you were never supposed to read. And when it does, it changes everything. The image of a mother mourning her child, wrapped in grief and love, shatters, leaving only the cold, empty truth behind. Here's a question for you. What if the story you've been told, the one you've accepted without a second thought, isn't quite as simple as it seems? What if the truth was buried beneath layers of grief, confusion, and, dare I say, a whole lot of emotional baggage? We've all heard it a million times. It was just an accident. It's the phrase that soothes, that makes everything seem a little less dark. But what if that phrase was nothing more than a neatly packaged lie? What if the truth, lurking in the shadows, was something far darker? Now buckle up. We're about to revisit the tragic death of 16-month-old Earl Dwayne Bunch III. The official story is easy to swallow, a simple, heartbreaking accident. He fell from his crib. Tragic, yes. Unavoidable even. But when we take a deeper look, nothing about this tragedy feels that simple. Not the way Earl's mother, Alice, reacted. Not the eerie calm that seemed to wash over her. Not the unnerving sense of distance she displayed. Could it have been a tragic accident? Or was something far more sinister at play? Something buried in Alice's cold detachment. Something so deep that she couldn't, or wouldn't, let anyone see it. All right, let's rewind for a second. Here's the story as it was told. Earl, a sweet 16-month-old boy, dies after falling from his crib. It's the kind of accident that makes you gasp and then sigh with sympathy. The kind of thing that makes you want to hug your own child just a little bit tighter. So, naturally, the authorities labeled it an accident, and that's where the story ended, right? Well, not quite. The thing is, when a child dies, we expect grief. We expect something. Some sign, some outward display of mourning. Maybe it's a mother clutching a photo, unable to hold back the tears. Maybe it's a father, lost in the horror of what's just happened. But when it came to Alice, something just didn't feel right. Instead of wailing, instead of the shattered, heartbroken sobs you might expect, Alice was calm, almost disturbingly calm. She didn't throw herself into her grief. She didn't even seem to show the kind of visible shock you'd think someone would have after losing their child. Instead, there was silence. And in that silence, an unsettling question began to grow. Was this really just an accident? Let's pause here for a moment, because Alice's reaction to her son's death deserves more than just a passing glance. In fact, it demands scrutiny. You see, we all have our own ways of grieving. Some of us scream and cry, some of us become numb, and some of us, well, we turn inward. But when Alice lost Earl, the world expected a grieving mother. The world expected her to publicly crumble under the weight of her loss. Instead, Alice gave them nothing. Well, nothing except a strange calmness, a coldness that made people raise eyebrows. Now don't get me wrong, grief manifests in strange ways. But this wasn't just strange. This was unnerving. Imagine losing a child. Can you picture it? The pain, the loss, the feeling of your entire world shattering. But Alice, she didn't seem to feel any of that, or at least she didn't show it. Instead of comforting her family or seeking solace in the arms of loved ones, Alice seemed to retreat into a shell of apathy. No visible breakdown, no public tears. In fact, some who were close to her noted that it was almost as if she had emotionally checked out. She seemed unaffected, disconnected. It was the kind of calm that might make a person wonder, is she hiding something? I'm not saying Alice didn't love her son. Of course she did. But we have to ask, did she mourn Earl's death the way we expect? Or is there something more complicated at play here? See, some people grieve silently. Some people hide their pain so well that you might never know they're suffering. And then there are others who repress their emotions so deeply that they appear completely numb. It's like they're walking around in a fog, disconnected from everything and everyone, including themselves.
Could that have been Alice's reality? Could she have been so emotionally overwhelmed that she shut down completely? Could the pain have been so unbearable that she couldn't even process it, let alone show it to the world? Or, and this is the part that sends shivers down your spine, could she have been hiding something far darker? Something she didn't want anyone to know? Something that made her unable to feel, unable to grieve, because deep down, she knew something about that night that no one else did? The more we dig into Alice's reaction, the more we start to ask ourselves, what if this wasn't an accident at all? What if Alice's eerie calm wasn't just emotional detachment, but the quiet facade of someone who had already made peace with a far darker truth? What if, instead of mourning her son, she was hiding the truth of what really happened that night? Sure, the authorities ruled it an accident, a fall from the crib. Simple, straightforward, tragic. But we know how it goes. Sometimes the simplest explanations are the ones that hide the darkest secrets. And let me tell you this story. It stinks of something that doesn't quite add up. A mother's strange indifference, a mysterious child's death. It all starts to feel like something more. Something far more sinister than a tragic fall. So, here's the question that begins to haunt us. What did Alice really feel toward her son? We've heard the official story. We've seen the reactions. We know what the police thought. But what did Alice herself know? Was there a reason she never cried? Was there a reason she never screamed? Or was her silence, her coldness, a mask for a far deeper, more terrifying truth? The question lingers, like an unwelcome guest that refuses to leave. It scratches at the back of your mind, asking for answers. But the more you dig, the more you realize that the truth, it's still hiding. And for now, all we have is the eerie silence of a mother who refuses to speak. Time has a funny way of burying secrets. It lulls people into a false sense of closure, making them believe that the past is better left untouched. But the thing about the past, It doesn't like being ignored. It waits, quietly, lurking in old photographs, whispered suspicions, and the unshakable feeling that something just doesn't add up. For years, Earl Dwayne Bunch III was just another name in the archives, another tragic accident, another case closed. But closed cases don't always stay that way. Not when there are still questions, unanswered, festering, refusing to fade. And not when a family refuses to accept silence as the final word. Because, decades later, the whispers turned into demands. The quiet suspicions became loud enough that the authorities had no choice but to listen. And when they did, well, let's just say what they found made the word accident seem like a very, very bad joke. Imagine waking up every single day with the same question haunting you. What really happened that night? Earl's family had lived with that question for years. Decades, actually. And the worst part, no answers. Just the same official story, repeated like a broken record. He fell. It was tragic. Case closed. But grief has a way of sharpening into something else, something less soft, something with teeth. And as the years passed, that grief turned into suspicion, into anger, into an unrelenting push for the truth. They pleaded with authorities, again and again, asked them to take another look, asked them to see what they had always felt in their bones, that something wasn't right, that a mother's eerie calm wasn't just shock, that a death ruled an accident might not have been an accident at all. And finally, after years of being ignored, someone listened. The case was reopened. And what they found, well, let's just say, it was enough to make even the most seasoned investigators pause. When investigators exhumed Earl's tiny remains, they weren't expecting much. After all, this was a case that had been gathering dust for decades. But as they examined his bones, the story they told was disturbing. Blunt force trauma. Signs of injury that didn't match a simple fall. Fractures in places they shouldn't be. And suddenly, the neat little explanation of he fell from his crib started looking a whole lot shakier. Because babies fall. It happens. But the injuries Earl sustained, they weren't the kind of thing you get from tumbling a couple of feet. They were the kind of injuries that made investigators ask a much darker question. Was this child beaten? For years, the world had believed in an accident. A tragedy, yes, but a blameless one. And yet, the evidence in front of them told a different story. A story of something far more violent, far more deliberate. Earl hadn't just fallen. Something had happened to him. The case files were dusted off. The old interviews re-examined. And with every piece of evidence that surfaced, the doubt grew. Investigators started seeing the cracks in the original case. The inconsistencies that had been ignored. The cold mother. The lack of visible grief. The way Alice had seemed so unmoved by her own child's death. And suddenly, the question wasn't did Earl fall. The question was who hurt him. For Earl's family, this wasn't just a revelation. It was a nightmare, played out in slow motion. They had lived with loss for years. But loss was one thing. Knowing that Earl's death wasn't an accident, that it might have been something far worse, that was something else entirely. Rage, confusion, a sense of betrayal that couldn't be put into words. They had fought for the truth, but now that they had it, it felt like a second wave of grief, one even heavier than the first. Because now, they weren't just mourning Earl. They were mourning justice. The justice he never got. The years that had passed. The fact that someone had gotten away with it for this long. And the most terrifying question of all, could they still get away with it? The walls were closing in. Investigators knew they were onto something. The family refused to back down. The community that had once accepted this as a tragic accident now had reason to believe otherwise. The pressure was building. The truth was unraveling. But would it be enough? Because the thing about reopening a case after so many years, it's a race against time. Evidence fades. Witnesses disappear. And justice? Well, justice has a bad habit of slipping through the cracks. Will they finally get answers? Or would this case, like so many others, be buried once again? One thing was certain. The past was no longer content to stay buried. And the truth? It was clawing its way to the surface. Time does funny things to a person. It can soften the sharp edges of memory, blur the lines between guilt and innocence, and make even the most monstrous crimes feel like ancient history. But time has never been great at hiding the truth forever. Because one day, when Alice Marie Idlett was 75 years old, wrinkled, gray-haired, and looking like the sweet old lady who might offer you a Werther's original at church. The past finally caught up with her, and instead of knitting on her porch, she was being led away in handcuffs. Some people age gracefully. Alice, well, she aged into a murder suspect. Picture a quiet neighborhood, birds chirping, the faint hum of a lawnmower in the distance, and then police cars, flashing lights, officers stepping out, walking up the path with purpose. Inside, Alice sits in her chair, maybe watching television, maybe sipping on a cup of tea, maybe, just for a moment, she believes she's gotten away with it. Then knock knock, and just like that, the illusion shatters. The officers step inside. They say her name. She looks up, and in that moment, the weight of decades crashes down on her like an avalanche. She's arrested for the murder of her son, a crime that happened before the internet, before cell phones, before half the officers in that room were even born, a crime that should have been forgotten, but wasn't. And now, it's too late to run. You ever notice how people love to say, "She didn't look like the type," whenever someone gets arrested? Well, that's exactly what happened here. Alice wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the alleyways. She wasn't the kind of villain you see in horror movies. No, she was a grandma, an old woman with thinning hair and soft hands, and the kind of face that made you think of fresh-baked cookies. So when the news broke, the shock was seismic. Neighbors who had known her for decades couldn't believe it. Not Alice. She used to babysit my kids. She always kept her yard so neat. She made the best apple pie. And yet, behind that frail frame was a woman who had kept a horrifying secret for over 50 years. The question on everyone's lips wasn't just how she did it. It was how she lived with it. Now let's talk about Alice. Because at this point, the question isn't whether she did it. The evidence, the letters, the forensic analysis, the cold, hard facts, made it pretty clear. No, the real question is, did she care? Was she a woman haunted by guilt, tormented every single day by the memory of her son's final moments? Did she wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, seeing his tiny face? Or did she feel nothing? Was she just a woman who had locked the past away, shoved it deep into the back of her mind, and lived the rest of her life like it had never happened? Because if she had felt remorse, if she had spent the last 50 years drowning in guilt, then you'd expect some kind of breakdown, some kind of confession. But Alice, she didn't say much. Her face stayed calm. Her expression stayed unreadable. And that's what made it so chilling. For Earl's family, this moment should have been justice. They had fought for this. They had begged for this. And yet, when it finally happened, when Alice was in handcuffs, when the truth was out, why did it still feel so hollow? Because this wasn't just a random criminal. This was their mother, their grandmother, someone they had loved, someone who had tucked them into bed, kissed their foreheads, told them she loved them. And now, they had to reckon with the fact that the woman who had nurtured them had taken the life of one of their own. It wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal. And even though justice was finally being served, it came with a devastating realization. No matter how many years had passed, no matter how much time had tried to bury the truth, it had never been forgotten. And now, neither would Alice. Courtrooms have a strange way of bringing out the truth. It doesn't matter how long you've spent running from it, how many decades you've buried it under a mask of normalcy. Because once you're standing in front of a judge, with a jury staring at you, and a prosecutor who looks like they skipped breakfast just to eat you alive, well, there's nowhere left to hide. For Alice Marie Idlett, her time was up, and this wasn't just a trial. It was the slow, painful unraveling of a mother's soul. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, family members, curious onlookers, all squeezed into the benches, waiting for a glimpse of the woman who had kept a deathly secret for over 50 years. Alice sat at the defense table, small and quiet, her white hair neatly combed. She looked more like someone's lost grandmother than a woman on trial for murdering her own child. And maybe that was the most unsettling part. The prosecution, though, they weren't fooled. They had one job, to paint Alice not as the frail old woman people saw before them, but as the mother who, in 1970, had written a letter saying, "I hate him. He's ruining my life." And then, shortly after, found herself with a dead child and a very convenient accident to explain it. Yeah, they were not about to let her off easy. The lead prosecutor was sharp. calculated. The kind of person who probably practiced their death stare in the mirror every morning. And they wasted no time. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, they began pacing the courtroom floor, voice dripping with conviction. What we have here is not a grieving mother, but a guilty one. A mother who viewed her own child not with love, but with resentment. Who saw him not as a blessing, but as a burden. Then, boom, the letters were projected onto the courtroom screen. The jury's eyes scanned the words. Words that no mother should ever write. I hate him. He's ruining my life. I can't stand this anymore. The room shifted. A discomfort settled over the spectators. Because hearing about it was one thing. Seeing it, black and white, her own handwriting, was something else entirely. And for Alice, sitting there, listening to her own words turn into a noose around her neck, it was clear. There was no escaping this. Then came the hardest part. The family testimonies. One by one, they took the stand. Earl's relatives. His siblings. People who had spent decades wondering. People who had defended Alice for years. Because surely, their own mother could never do something so horrific. But now, they weren't so sure anymore. One of Earl's surviving siblings stood before the jury, voice shaking, hands gripping the edges of the podium, as if it was the only thing holding them up. I spent my whole life believing my mother was a good person, they whispered. I spent my whole life thinking my brother's death was an accident. And now, I have to live with the fact that the woman who raised me, the woman I loved, killed him. The words were a blade to the heart. Even Alice, who had remained emotionless through most of the trial, flinched. Just slightly. Just enough for the cameras to catch it. See, this wasn't just a legal battle. This was psychological warfare. Because it wasn't just about proving Alice's guilt. It was about forcing her to confront it. Forcing her to sit there, silent, powerless, while her children, her own flesh and blood, stood before her and spoke their truth. And for a woman who had spent her entire life burying her past, that was a fate worse than prison. The room was silent. The jury had gone to deliberate. Alice sat motionless. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't beg for forgiveness. Maybe she had already spent years convincing herself that this day would never come. Maybe she had thought she could outrun her past forever. But time doesn't forget, and neither did the people sitting in that room, waiting for the verdict that would decide whether Alice Marie Idlett would spend the rest of her days as a free woman or as an inmate. Because justice may take its time, but eventually, it always arrives. Some truths don't set you free. Some truths don't bring comfort, don't offer peace, don't wrap things up in a neat little bow. Some truths feel like a knife to the gut, even when you already suspected the blade was coming. For Alice Marie Idlett's family, the truth had finally arrived, and it came in the form of one word. Guilty. The courtroom was still, the air thick, the weight of 5 decades of doubt, grief, and unanswered questions pressed down on everyone like a suffocating fog. The judge delivered the sentence. Alice, now 75 years old, would spend the remainder of her life behind bars. Justice was served, but did it really feel like justice? Or was it just another tragedy in a story already drenched in sorrow? When the gavel hit the bench, marking the official end of the trial, there was no cheering, no sighs of relief, no celebration. Instead, there was a silence that felt too loud. The kind of silence that follows a funeral, not a victory. Because the truth was, justice hadn't brought Earl back. It hadn't erased the years of pain his family had endured. It hadn't changed the fact that the person they had called Mom had been capable of something monstrous. And that was a wound that no verdict could heal. Betrayal doesn't fade overnight. It lingers. It festers. It reshapes the way people see the past. For decades, Alice's children had carried memories of their mother, her laugh, her touch, the warmth of her presence. But now, every memory had a dark shadow lurking behind it. The bedtime stories, the birthday parties, the Christmas mornings, all of it, now tainted by the knowledge that the same hands that once held them had taken the life of their brother. How do you move on from that? How do you grieve for a mother you lost twice? Once to her crime, and again to the truth? Inside her prison cell, Alice didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't cry. She didn't even react when the cell door slammed shut behind her. Maybe she had already spent a lifetime making peace with what she had done. Or maybe she had never cared to begin with. Because even in court, even in the face of evidence that could shake the soul of any person with a conscience, Alice had sat cold, expressionless, almost indifferent. Did she feel remorse? Did she regret the crime? Or just the fact that she had been caught? No one would ever really know. And at this point, maybe it didn't matter anymore. For the family, Alice's conviction was supposed to bring closure. But closure isn't the same as healing. The loss of Earl had been a wound they carried for 50 years. And now, with the truth laid bare, that wound wasn't healing. It was just changing shape. Because knowing the truth is one thing, but living with it, that's something else entirely. They had justice. But peace? That would take much, much longer. Justice had come. But at what cost? A mother lost to the system. A family shattered by betrayal. And a little boy, Earl Idlett, who never got to grow up, never got to live the life he deserved. Some crimes steal a life in an instant. Others, they destroy people slowly, over decades, piece by piece. This crime had done both. And the question that lingered in the air, long after Alice was gone, long after the courtroom doors had closed, was simple. When the truth you feared the most finally comes to light, are you really set free? Or do you just learn to live with the weight of knowing? Because some truths don't bring peace. Some truths just haunt you forever. Some betrayals fade with time. Some wounds scab over, turn into stories you tell at family gatherings, lessons you pass down, cautionary tales wrapped in hindsight. And then, there are betrayals so deep, so unforgivable, that they settle into your bones, whispering their presence with every breath you take. The kind of betrayal that makes you question everything. Your childhood, your memories, your very existence. So let's ask the real question here. Could you ever forgive someone who betrayed you in the most unimaginable way? Forgiveness is easy when the wounds are shallow. But what about when the scars run so deep they change the way you see the world? What happens when the person who was supposed to love and protect you turns out to be the very reason you suffer? For Alice Idlett's children, this wasn't just about justice. This was about rewriting their entire understanding of their mother. For decades, they lived with doubt. Now, they lived with certainty. And somehow, that was worse. Because at least before, there had been room for hope. Now, there was just the cold, hard truth. Some might say that knowing the truth is better than living in ignorance. But is it? Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the person who tucked you in at night, the person who kissed your forehead, the person you called mom, had been keeping a horrific secret all along. That every holiday, every birthday, every moment of love had been tainted by a crime you didn't even know existed. How do you move forward? How do you carry that weight? And more importantly, how do you forgive? Justice was served. The truth came out. But for the Idlett family, the real battle wasn't fought in a courtroom. It was fought within themselves. Do you think you could forgive? Could you look into the eyes of someone who shattered your world and say, I forgive you? Or is there a point where forgiveness simply isn't an option? Let's talk about it. Drop a comment below. Do you believe in second chances, even for the worst of betrayals? Or are some sins just too deep, too dark, too unforgivable? And if you've been hooked by this story, if you love diving into the mysteries of human nature, the chilling twists of real-life crime, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime stories that don't just tell you what happened, but make you feel it. Because the world is full of stories that haunt us, and we're here to tell them. See you in the next one.